Um, yeah, so my name's Śraddhāpa. Um, I'm originally from Scotland, but I lived in Norway for a long time. Um, and I've also, as well as a Buddhist, I've also been an animal rights activist for many years. So I'm also a board member of NOA for Animal Rights, which is the largest animal rights organization in Norway. And I moved from Norway to Taiwan a few years ago in order to pursue academic study of Buddhism, because there's much better opportunities for doing that in Asia than in Europe. So, I mean, listening to the other presentations, one question that's kind of emerged a bit for me is the difference between an animal welfare perspective and an animal rights perspective. Because for me, that's something that I would distinguish very clearly. And I would see those two discourses as really being in opposition to each other rather than complementary. So I was interested that the previous speakers didn't seem to talk partly in terms of animal rights, partly in terms of animal welfare. So that might be something we could come back to a little bit more in the discussion afterwards. So I want to talk a little bit about both veganism and the climate crisis. But for me, I don't want to link those two things too closely, because obviously, if we lived in a vegan world, that would have a very positive impact on the climate crisis. But when those two issues are linked very closely, it can often seem like the reason that we should go vegan is because of the climate crisis. But in fact, I think that there are very strong arguments for being vegan, and there are very strong arguments for tackling the climate crisis. And those two sets of arguments both stand on their own merits, and the fact that they reinforce each other is a bonus. So I'm going to start off by talking about veganism, and I'm going to talk about a couple of basic Buddhist principles. And like the other speakers, I'm going to deal with some of the arguments that Buddhists use to justify animal exploitation, and why I don't think they hold up. So yeah, I don't have a very detailed presentation, but I have some quotes. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about Buddhist ethics and explaining kind of the foundation for Buddhist ethics, because it's quite different to the ethical systems that I think a lot of people who are mostly familiar with the Abrahamic religions are familiar with. I think for a lot of people, when they think about ethics and religion, they think about it very much in terms of rules of a kind of more legally based system. And that kind of thinking is really absent in Buddhism. Buddhism, with one exception, which I'll come back to, doesn't really have any legalistic form of ethics. The Buddha is not an authority figure. There is no God in Buddhism. So Buddhism doesn't have any rules, and it doesn't have anyone that has the authority to hand down any rules or enforce any rules. Buddhist ethics is based on the idea of action and consequence, the idea that all actions have consequences. The Buddha and any Buddhist teacher doesn't have any authority to hand down any rules. The Buddha simply described his observance of how the process of cause and effect functions, the process of action and consequence functions. So if you read Buddhist texts which talk about ethics, when the Buddha is quoted, he doesn't say you should do this, or it's wrong to do that. What he'll say is, if you act in this way, it will benefit you. If you act in that way, it will harm you. if you want to make progress in your spiritual life, this is what you should do. But it's always a kind of conditional structure. If this is what you want, if you want to experience happiness rather than suffering, then this is how I recommend you act. But we're fundamentally responsible for our own actions and their consequences. The principle I want to talk about, because in only 20 minutes, I can only talk about a few points that are relevant within Buddhism. But one point I wanted to draw out is the idea of loving kindness, which is also expressed in the principle of non-violence. And this is fundamental to Buddhist ethics and Buddhist thinking, and to the way that Buddhists, it represents the ideal that Buddhists have for how we should interact with other living beings, humans and animals and whatever other living beings might be out there. So I want to start with a very famous quote from a Buddhist text. In the same way as a mother protects her only child with her life, one should cultivate a boundless attitude towards all living beings. One should cultivate an attitude of boundless loving kindness for the whole world, unobstructed in all directions and free from enmity and hostility. So this is the ideal that Buddhists are striving for. And it's very much a high ideal. I mean, Buddhist texts often talk in terms of a mother's love for her child, which is kind of the archetypal, the archetype of selfless love. And the ideal in Buddhism is that that's the way we should feel towards all living beings. And of course, if we, to the extent that we manage to cultivate that inner attitude, our actions will then be based on the principle of non-violence or non-harming. So this has some important practical consequences. So there are considered to be, in terms of work, there are 5 kinds of work that are explicitly advised against for Buddhist practitioners, which is trading in weapons, trading in living beings, trading in meat, trading in intoxicants, and trading in poisons. So obviously, in principle, that precludes any Buddhist from any commercial involvement in animal agriculture, whether as a farmer, a butcher, selling animal products. And then, I skipped, yes. And this, I think, is a very important quote that's often skipped over a bit by Buddhists who want to justify meat eating. But to me, this is very clear and very important. So there are 4 qualities that will cause one to end up in hell. They're killing living beings oneself, causing others to kill living beings, approving of the killing of living beings, and speaking in praise of the killing of living beings. So there's what you'll very often encounter if you talk to Buddhists who are not vegan about meat eating or the consumption of animal products. The argument they'll give is that, well, if Buddhists aren't allowed to kill animals themselves, but if the animal's already dead, if it's already been killed, then I'm not responsible for that if I eat the meat. But I think this principle, this expression of the principle of non-violence makes it very clear that that's not really feasible. But this attitude that, well, if I don't do it, then I'm not responsible, has led to a situation in many, majority Buddhist societies where, Buddhists themselves will not engage in the slaughter of animals, but they'll get someone else to do it. Usually in most Buddhist societies, it's a Muslim minority. And so they're allowed to do the dirty work of killing the animals that the Buddhists won't do themselves, but the Buddhists are quite happy to buy the products and not feel responsible for the consequences. So I said earlier that there aren't rules in Buddhism, but the exception is that there is a set of rules for monastic life. The Buddha founded a monastic community of monks and nuns, and there's a whole set of regulations for how members of those monastic communities should live. Those regulations mostly don't have anything to do with ethics. They're mostly kind of administrative. There are rules about, what kind of clothes to wear and how often to meet and how big your hut should be and all sorts of things. Some of them overlap with ethics, but they're not fundamentally ethical rules. They're defining what the minimum requirements are for being a member of that monastic community, and also what constitutes an offense that you have to confess. So just because something doesn't break the monastic rules doesn't necessarily mean it's ethical. It just means it's not unethical enough that you have to confess it, or that it will get you punished or chucked out of the monastic order. So this is the quote that you will very often hear Buddhists come up with when you ask them about eating meat, which is, "You should not enjoy meat which has been killed specifically for you. Anyone who does so commits an offense. Monks, I approve of fish and meat which is pure in three ways: not seen, not heard, and not suspected." So the meaning is a bit opaque there, but what it means is this is referring to a very particular social economic situation that the monastic community in India in the time of the Buddha 2,500 years ago existed in. It was an accepted social institution in India at that time that spiritual seekers could leave their homes, leave their jobs, basically exit society in order to be full-time spiritual practitioners. But they would be supported by people who were still, economically active and part of society. And the main way that they were supported was by begging for food. They would go literally from door to door, and those who wanted to support them would give them usually just a small amount of whatever food they were eating, some leftovers, or just a spoonful of whatever food they'd prepared. And so in that context, for monks and nuns who were begging for food, if the food that they were given as alms included meat, they were allowed to accept it on the condition that no animal had been killed specifically for them. So, if a layperson thought, oh well, there's going to be some monks and nuns coming, so I'll get some meat for them, then in that case they weren't allowed to accept it if they knew that was the case, or if they suspected that was the case. And of course, in India at that time, that there weren't supermarkets, so if you wanted meat, generally involved killing an animal or having an animal killed. And again, another place in the Buddhist scriptures makes it clear that anyone who kills a living being for the sake of the Tathagata, that's the Buddha or one of the Buddha's disciples, brings grave negative consequences upon themselves. So, we have a situation where monks and nuns are teaching this principle of loving kindness and non-violence, and encouraging vegetarianism. And if you look historically within India, the spread of vegetarianism in India coincided with the spread of Buddhism. So these texts I've quoted from so far from the early Buddhist, the Theravada tradition. In later Buddhism, Mahayana, which was the form of Buddhism that spread to China and Tibet and the rest of East Asia, the later Mahayana scriptures are much clearer in terms of a prohibition on meat eating, or a strong discouragement of meat eating. So in this later text, it says, meat which is pure in three respects does not exist, therefore meat should not be eaten. It's from the Lankavatara Sutra, which is from about 600 or 700 years after the Buddha. And then, if no one ate any kind of meat, then there would be no killing in order to produce it. innocent beings are generally slain for profit and rarely for any other reason. So because of this, this text in particular, the Lankavatara Sutra, is much clearer and much more unambiguous than the earlier rules. Because of that, vegetarianism is much more widespread amongst Buddhists in places like China, Taiwan, Korea, than is the case in Southeast Asia that follow the earlier scriptures. So then I want to talk a little bit about the climate crisis. And I think a perspective in Buddhism that that can be useful, not just to Buddhists, but I think hopefully more broadly, is the idea of interdependence, which is the kind of more general perspective that this idea of action and consequence comes from. Just as in terms of ethics, every action has a consequence. In Buddhism, the description of the way that reality functions is based on the idea of cause and effect. That things don't happen randomly, that everything arises on the basis of causes and conditions. And that also means that we as people, as individuals, are fundamentally connected to the rest of the universe. We usually think of ourselves almost as like bubbles moving around in the world, interacting with other things. We see ourselves as these kind of discrete objects, but in fact, we're completely interdependent with our environment. We're completely dependent on air, water, food, the societies we live in, the cultures, the economic systems. We can't exist independently from our environment, but we don't often think in those terms. We don't often see ourselves in those terms. But rather than kind of bubbles moving around in the world, I think a better metaphor is we're like nodes of connection. We're nodes where, if you think of a network of wires or strings that come together at certain points, what we think of ourselves as me is actually just the nexus of a whole network of different relationships, relationships to our environment, to our society, our personal relationships. And if you remove all those relationships, then there's nothing left. There's no core. And so this way of looking at human beings as fundamentally part of the universe, part of nature, connected to nature, I think is something that can be an antidote to the kind of thinking that's led us to the climate crisis that we're in. Buddhism's fundamentally a training in facing reality the way it actually is, with the filters of how we would like it to be removed. And I think that's much of what's missing in terms of the attitudes and the perspectives that have led us to the climate crisis we're in now. So I think Buddhism has something to contribute in terms of the perspectives of loving kindness and non-violence, and also the idea of interconnectedness. So I just wanted to mention briefly, I've written a bit, if you want to read more about vegetarianism and Buddhism, I have some information on my website, and I have the translation of the part of the Lankavatara Sutra that talks about meat eating in Buddhism. I also wanted to mention just a couple of other websites. There's within the Extinction Rebellion movement, there is a kind of Buddhist subgroup who are engaged very much in direct action to counter the climate crisis. So they do a lot of very admirable work. So if you're interested, I'd encourage you to have a look at their website. And there's also this great resource, shabkar.org, named after a famous Tibetan Buddhist vegetarian teacher, which has lots of information and resources about vegetarianism and Buddhism. So I'm not quite sure how I'm doing for time. Have I gone over my 20 minutes, or am I okay? Anyway, if there's any questions, I'm happy to take questions. Or
yeah,
we can wait to
thank you so much. Very, very interesting. And You can hear me now, yes?
Yes, yes.
Yes, yes. So I ask the panelists if you have some kind of follow-up or reaction to this interesting presentation. Paula, Sarah, Philip, Marie.
I'll just say that I thought it was really interesting. That was very enlightening. Thank you for sharing.
Thanks.
I think also it was very interesting. I have a question. I think this notion of action and consequence, cause and effect, and interdependence sounds great. And if you would practice it, you would really not, we wouldn't have been in the situation we are now. But my question is, in order to understand the consequences, you have to be very knowledgeable. I mean, most people, even educated people, they don't realize that if they do something, it will cause harm. So how is that seen upon?
I suppose Buddhists would see it in what you might call quite psychological terms. So that there are some basic guidelines in Buddhism in terms of what kinds of actions have positive consequences and what kinds have negative consequences. So, you know, there are what we call five precepts, five kind of training principles that you find in all forms of Buddhism, that Buddhists try and act on the basis of loving kindness, of generosity, of contentment, truthfulness, and mental clarity or mindfulness. But yes, it's difficult. I mean, Buddhism is not it's not a set of rules to be followed. It's a training to be engaged in, and it's progressive. So, you know, Buddhists would rely on the teachings of the Buddha and of other Buddhist teachers because we believe that they see things more clearly than we do, and we're prepared to take their advice. But Buddhism also involves developing, you know, your own mental clarity and trying to see things more clearly. So that, I mean, that's where meditation comes in, and there's a whole, you know, system of training which basically constitutes Buddhism.
Okay, thank you so much, Philip.
I was thinking that there might be a parallel here, and the example that occurred to me in Leviticus 25 and Deuteronomy 11 of the Older Testament, the scriptures which we share with Christians and Judaism share. There is a promise that if if a community lives within the covenant of God, then as it were, the earth will cooperate with us. The crops will grow, the rain will fall, the land will be fertile, animals will thrive, and so on. If we don't do that, then the consequence will be the opposite. And I think that there's a clear implication of that, illustration of that in the situation we now find ourselves in, that we haven't lived within the covenant of God. We have treated animals abysmally cruelly. We have poisoned the land and the sea. We have been indifferent towards God's creation, and the consequence of that is what we now see. And this is set out for us in terms of action and consequences, as has just been outlined in the covenant, in the Mosaic covenant.
Okay.
I think I just point out that
Yes,
the difference in Buddhism is that the action and consequence is seen as being completely natural. So it's seen in the same terms as, you know, the law of gravity. Just as Newton observed and described the law of gravity, Buddhists would see the Buddha as observing and describing the way the universe works. But those processes are completely natural and impersonal. There's no divine intervention or Buddhic intervention or control over those processes. The Buddha simply describes.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. That would be a distinction, and that within the Judeo-Christian tradition, everything from the consequences of our treatment of animals through the Newtonian laws of gravity would be rooted within the will of God. Yes, that's true.